A racist store owner calls the police on a black woman, but is shocked to discover who she is. Have you ever imagined being publicly humiliated because of your skin color, then having the chance to teach your aggressor an unforgettable lesson? New York City, February 15th, 2025. The winter sun shone weakly on Fifth Avenue. Jasmine Williams, a 35-year-old black lawyer, entered the luxury boutique Supreme Elegance, looking for a dress for an important business dinner. Little did she know that this simple act of shopping would turn into a battle against deeply rooted prejudices in American society. Before we continue, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon to never miss a captivating story like this one. And in the comments, tell us which city you're watching from. As she entered the women's clothing section, Jasmine was immediately followed by a security guard who watched her closely, as if she were a potential criminal. Trying to ignore the suspicious gaze, she began examining the elegant dresses displayed on the racks. That's when Richard Thompson, the store manager, a middle-aged white man dressed in an impeccable suit, approached with a forced smile. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Richard asked, his condescending tone barely masking his prejudice. Jasmine, accustomed to facing such situations, took a deep breath and calmly replied, "I'm just looking for a dress for an important dinner. Thank you for your concern, but I can manage on my own." The manager didn't walk away. Instead, he continued to observe Jasmine's every move, making derogatory comments under his breath to other employees. The tension in the air was palpable, and other customers began to notice the uncomfortable situation. Determined not to let prejudice win, Jasmine chose an elegant black dress and headed to the fitting room. As she admired herself in the mirror, feeling beautiful and powerful, she heard a commotion outside. Richard, the manager, was shouting accusations of theft. "I saw you hiding merchandise. Open your bag immediately or I'm calling the police," the manager vociferated, his voice echoing throughout the store. Jasmine, shocked and humiliated, stepped out of the fitting room to face her accuser. "Sir, this is absurd. I haven't hidden anything. I'm here to shop like any other customer," Jasmine argued, her voice trembling with anger and frustration. But Richard didn't back down. With a smirk, he pulled out his cell phone and called the police. "We have a theft case here. A black woman is trying to steal luxury goods. I need a patrol immediately," he said on the phone, casting a disdainful look at Jasmine. The minutes that followed seemed like an eternity. Curious and horrified customers formed a circle around the scene, some filming with their smartphones, others murmuring their disapproval of the manager's attitude. Jasmine, feeling the weight of years of discrimination on her shoulders, struggled to keep her composure. As police sirens began to sound in the distance, Jasmine's heart raced. But instead of the fear Richard expected to see in her eyes, there was fierce determination. She knew this moment wasn't just about her, but about all the people who had suffered similar injustices. With trembling hands, Jasmine reached into her bag. The manager smiled, thinking he was finally going to catch the thief red-handed. But what Jasmine pulled out surprised everyone present. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice now firm and resolute. "Perhaps this will help clarify the situation." In her hand, Jasmine held a card that instantly wiped the smile off Richard's face. What did Jasmine reveal at that moment? What will be the outcome of this racially charged confrontation? Will the consequences of this discriminatory action be more significant than Richard could imagine? The card Jasmine held in her hands was an official credential from the U.S. Department of Justice. She wasn't just an ordinary lawyer. Jasmine Williams was a federal civil rights attorney, specializing in discrimination cases. Richard's face turned pale, and a leaden silence fell over the boutique. "Mr. Thompson," Jasmine began, her voice now charged with authority, "as a representative of the Department of Justice, I am deeply concerned about what I've just experienced in this establishment." Meanwhile, police officers arrived at the boutique, observing the scene with curiosity. Jasmine turned to them, formally introducing herself and briefly explaining the situation. The officers, recognizing the gravity of the incident, began to gather statements from the present customers. Richard Thompson, now visibly shaken, tried to stammer an excuse. I didn't know. It was a misunderstanding." But his words rang hollow in the face of the magnitude of his error. As the news spread through the boutique, employees and customers began to share their own experiences. A young black saleswoman, Tanya, found the courage to approach Jasmine. "Ms. Williams," she said in a low voice, "this isn't the first time this has happened here. Mr. Thompson, He always treats black customers differently. Many of us, black employees, have been suffering from his comments and attitudes for years. Jasmine listened attentively, her heart heavy at the reality unfolding. Supreme Elegance wasn't just a simple luxury boutique. It was a microcosm of the racial problems deeply rooted in American society. While the police continued their investigation, Jasmine noticed an elderly woman observing everything from a distance with an expression of disgust. As she approached, Jasmine discovered it was Mrs. Eleanor Sinclair, the owner of the boutique. "I built this business from nothing," Mrs. Sinclair confessed, her voice trembling with emotion. "I never imagined it would become a place of discrimination. Richard was an exemplary employee in terms of numbers, but maybe I turned a blind eye to things I didn't want to see." Mrs. Sinclair's story revealed deeper layers of the problem. A daughter of Italian immigrants, she had grown up in an environment that, while not overtly racist, carried subtle prejudices. Her journey to build a luxury empire in the heart of New York was intrinsically tied to the racial complexities of America. Meanwhile, on social media, videos of the incident began to go viral. Hashtags like Supreme Racism and Justice for Jasmine were gaining popularity, sparking discussions about structural racism in American business. Richard, seeing his career crumbling before his eyes, tried one last card. "Ms. Williams, please, can't we settle this another way? I have a family, a son in college." Jasmine, however, remained firm. "Mr. Thompson, what happened here today is not an isolated incident. It's a reflection of a systemic problem that must be confronted. Your position of power in this boutique makes your actions even more serious." As the afternoon progressed, Supreme Elegance transformed into a theater of introspection and change. Mrs. Sinclair, confronted with the harsh reality of her complacency, began formulating plans for a complete overhaul of the company's policies. Tanya and other employees, encouraged by Jasmine's presence, formed a circle, sharing painful stories of microaggressions and subtle discrimination they had endured in silence for so long. In the midst of this whirlwind, Jasmine found herself reflecting on her own journey. Raised in a tough neighborhood in the Bronx, daughter of a bus driver and a nurse, she had overcome countless obstacles to get where she was. Every insult, every suspicious look, every door closed because of her color had forged an unshakable determination in her. Now, faced with this situation, Jasmine knew she had a unique opportunity. It wasn't just about punishing an individual, but about catalyzing broader change. How would she use her position and this experience to combat racism more effectively? What lessons could be drawn from this incident to educate and transform? As the sun began to set on bustling Fifth Avenue, casting long shadows, Jasmine knew that the real battles were yet to come. The incident at Supreme Elegance was just the beginning of a longer journey towards justice and equality. In the coming days and weeks, how would Jasmine navigate the complex web of law, media, and social change? Would this incident become a turning point in the fight against racism in America, or would it be swept under the rug like so many before it? In the days following the incident at Supreme Elegance, Jasmine Williams found herself at the center of a media storm. Newspapers, television shows, and digital influencers were vying for her attention, eager to hear her account and opinion on the case that was now making national headlines. As she headed to a new interview, this time for a renowned television debate show, Jasmine reflected on how to transform this attention into real change. The studio was packed, and she could feel the tension in the air. "Welcome, Ms. Williams," greeted the host, Jack Anderson, a middle-aged white man known for his controversial opinions. Many consider the Supreme Elegance incident a turning point in the discussion on racism in America. Do you agree? Jasmine took a deep breath before responding. "What happened to me is unfortunately not an isolated case. It's a reflection of a structural problem that persists in our society. The difference is that this time we have the means to expose it and discuss it openly." The interview quickly turned into a heated debate when another guest, entrepreneur Mark Stevens, intervened in the conversation. "With all due respect, Ms. Williams, don't you think we're exaggerating? The manager made a mistake, sure, but talking about structural racism, isn't that going too far?" Jasmine's blood boiled, but she kept her cool. "Mr. Stevens, what you call an exaggeration is the daily reality of millions of Black Americans and other minorities. The manager's error wasn't an isolated incident, but the result of years of entrenched prejudices and discriminatory policies." As the debate intensified, Jasmine realized she was fighting not only against explicit racism, but also against denial and minimization of the problem. Each of Mark's arguments was an opportunity to educate not only him, but also the millions of viewers. "Let me ask you this another way," Jasmine proposed, looking directly at the camera. "How many times have you, viewers at home, seen a black person in a leadership position in large companies? How many black professors did you have in college? How many black doctors have treated you at the hospital?" The silence in the studio was palpable. Jack, the host, seemed uncomfortable, but Jasmine continued. "Racism in America isn't always as explicit as in my case. Often it manifests in the lack of opportunities, daily microaggressions, limited representation." Mark, visibly irritated, retorted, "But what about anti-discrimination laws, diversity programs? Isn't the government doing enough already?" Jasmine smiled, not out of joy, but determination. "Laws and programs are important steps, but they're just the beginning. We need deep changes in our culture, our institutions, our way of thinking." As the debate continued, Jasmine received a message on her phone. It was from Tanya, the young saleswoman from Supreme Elegance. "Ms. Williams, we're watching the show here at the boutique. Your strength inspires us, but Richard, he's threatening to sue the boutique for wrongful termination. What should we do?" Jasmine's heart raced. The battle was far from over. She knew Richard wouldn't accept his defeat easily, and was now using the legal system, the same system Jasmine had sworn to defend, to try to get away with it. Turning her attention back to the debate, Jasmine realized she needed to change tactics. It wasn't enough to expose the problem. It was time to propose concrete solutions. "The Supreme Elegance case shows us that we need changes at multiple levels," she began. "First, we need stricter laws against racial discrimination, with real sanctions for offenders. Second, we need anti-racist education programs in schools and businesses. And third, we need more representation of minorities in positions of power and decision-making." Jasmine's words seemed to resonate not only in the studio, but across the country. On social media, her speech was going viral, with thousands of shares and comments. But as Jasmine fought on the public front, she knew an even bigger battle awaited her behind the scenes. Richard's threat to sue the boutique was just the beginning. How could she ensure that justice was served without Supreme Elegance and its employees suffering further? At the end of the show, exhausted but determined, Jasmine knew that every step from now on would be crucial. The incident in the boutique had opened a door, but keeping it open and promoting real change would require even more courage, strategy, and perseverance. As she left the studio, a question echoed in her mind. How far was she willing to go to ensure that her experience would become a real catalyst for change in American society? The next few weeks would be critical. Jasmine would need to navigate the complex landscape of media attention, legal battles, and grassroots organizing. Could she turn this single incident into a movement for lasting change? And what personal price would she have to pay in the process? In the weeks following the televised debate, Jasmine plunged into an intense legal and social battle. The Supreme Elegance case had become a turning point in the discussion on racism in America, but it brought unexpected challenges and surprising alliances. One morning, as she was examining documents in her heavily secured office, Jasmine received an unexpected visit. It was Mrs. Eleanor Sinclair, the owner of Supreme Elegance, who entered hesitantly, carrying a thick file. "Ms. Williams," Mrs. Sinclair began, her voice trembling, "I've spent the last few weeks investigating. What I've discovered, it's worse than we imagined." She opened the file, revealing financial reports and internal emails. Richard wasn't just discriminating against black customers and employees. He was involved in a system of merchandise diversion and money laundering. Jasmine felt the weight of this revelation. The case that had begun as a fight against racism was now taking unexpected turns. "Mrs. Sinclair, you understand that by bringing this to me, you're putting yourself in a vulnerable position." The lady nodded, determined. "I built my business with honesty. I can't allow it to be tainted this way. I want to do what's right, whatever the cost." Meanwhile, in another part of New York, Tanya, the young saleswoman, was fighting her own battles. Inspired by Jasmine's courage, she had become an active voice in the boutique, organizing meetings with other employees to discuss changes in internal policies. However, not everyone viewed her actions favorably. "Tanya, you need to stop stirring things up," her supervisor, a middle-aged man named Frank, warned her. "Some people are saying you're creating a hostile environment." The young woman felt a lump in her throat, but remained firm. "Frank, the environment was already hostile. The difference is that now we're talking about it." News of Richard's lawsuit against the boutique for wrongful termination had spread, creating divisions among employees. Some, fearing for their jobs, were beginning to wonder if the commotion caused by Jasmine and Tanya was worth it. Jasmine, aware of these tensions, knew she had to act quickly. She organized a meeting with leaders of anti-racist movements, lawyers specializing in labor law, and experts in corporate diversity. The goal was to create a comprehensive plan, not only to defend Supreme Elegance against Richard's lawsuit, but also to make it a model of inclusion and equity. However, as the case gained attention, Jasmine found herself facing personal threats. Hate messages flooded her social media, and she began to notice suspicious cars parked near her home. One evening, returning from a late meeting, Jasmine found her door forced open. The apartment was intact, but on her work desk was a photo of her with a target drawn on it. The message was clear. Someone wanted her to back down. Fighting against fear, Jasmine called her mentor, Judge Gloria Thompson, a retired federal judge who had been a pioneer in the fight against racism in the judicial system. "Jasmine, my dear," Gloria's experienced voice resonated comfortingly over the phone, "you've stirred up a hornet's nest. But remember, every threat you receive is proof that you're on the right track. Don't back down now." Strengthened by this support, Jasmine decided it was time to elevate the game. She called a press conference, where she not only denounced the threat she was receiving, but also announced the creation of a task force to investigate discriminatory practices in major luxury retail chains across America. "What began as an isolated incident has revealed a systemic problem," Jasmine declared to reporters. "We won't stop until every store, every company, every institution in this country understands that racism will no longer be tolerated." As cameras flashed and journalists bombarded her with questions, Jasmine felt the weight of her mission. She was no longer fighting just for herself, or even for the employees of Supreme Elegance. She was at the head of a movement that could change the social fabric of America. But with great movements come great resistances. Who was behind the threats? How would Jasmine protect those taking risks alongside her? And how deep did the roots of this corruption and discrimination run in the American business world? As night fell on New York City, Jasmine knew that the real battle was just beginning. The coming days would test her resolve, her legal skills, and her vision for a more just America. Could she turn this moment into a lasting movement for change? The Supreme Elegance case had transformed into a catalyst for broader social change, but Jasmine knew the real test was yet to come. A week after her press conference, she received a call that would change everything. "Ms. Williams?" The voice on the other end was hesitant, almost a whisper. "This is Michael Thompson, Richard's son." Jasmine felt her heart race. "Michael, how can I help you?" I have information. About my dad, about the boutique, about everything. But I need protection. They'll kill me if they find out I'm talking to you." The fear in the young man's voice was palpable. Jasmine acted quickly, arranging a secure meeting at a neutral location under the protection of trusted guards. A few hours later, in a discreet room at a downtown hotel, Jasmine found herself face to face with Michael. The young man in his 20s seemed to have aged a decade since the incident at the boutique. "My father," Michael began, his hands shaking as he held a cup of coffee. "He's not acting alone. There's a whole network behind all this. Politicians, businessmen, even some judges. The racism in the boutique was just the tip of the iceberg." Michael then revealed a complex network of corruption and systematic discrimination that extended far beyond Supreme Elegance. Documents, emails, and recordings showed how large companies collaborated to keep people of color out of positions of power, manipulated recruitment processes, and even sabotaged minority-owned businesses. "They call it maintaining the company profile," Michael explained, disgust evident in his voice. "But in reality, it's pure institutionalized racism." Jasmine listened, stunned. The scale of the conspiracy was far greater than she had ever imagined. "Michael, do you understand what you're doing by telling me all this? You're standing against your own father." The young man nodded, tears in his eyes. "I know, but I can't live with this anymore. What happened to you in the boutique? It was the last straw. I don't want to be part of this system anymore." As Jasmine absorbed this information, her phone rang. It was Tanya, panicked. "Ms. Williams, the boutique. It's on fire." Jasmine froze. Supreme Elegance was in flames, and she knew it wasn't a coincidence. It was a message, a clear threat from those who felt threatened by the investigation. Rushing to the scene, Jasmine found total chaos. Firefighters were battling the flames, while employees and customers watched, horrified. Mrs. Sinclair was inconsolable, seeing her life's work turn to ashes. Amidst the confusion, Jasmine spotted a familiar figure sneaking away. It was Frank, the supervisor who had warned Tanya. Their eyes met briefly, and at that moment Jasmine knew he was involved. Acting on instinct, Jasmine discreetly followed him, signaling to a nearby police officer. Frank, realizing he was being followed, began to run. The chase led them through narrow alleys and busy streets until they finally cornered him in a dead end. "It's over, Frank," said Jasmine, out of breath. "We know everything. You'd better start talking." Cornered, Frank broke down. Between sobs, he began to reveal names, dates, details that corroborated and expanded on the information provided by Michael. The conspiracy was even deeper and more sinister than Jasmine had imagined. Back at the fire scene, Jasmine found herself at the center of a media storm. Journalists were jostling, eager for information. That's when she made a decision that would change everything. Grabbing a megaphone from one of the firefighters, Jasmine climbed onto a nearby bench. "Attention!" her voice echoed down the street. "What happened here today was not an accident, it was an attack. An attack against all of us who dare to challenge a corrupt and racist system." The crowd fell silent. All attention turned to her. Television cameras were broadcasting live. "Today we discovered that the racism we face daily is not just the result of ill-intentioned individuals. It's a system carefully designed and maintained by those in power. But I promise you, we will expose every name, every company, every policy involved in this conspiracy." Her words resonated like thunder, reverberating through the city and soon across the country. At that moment, Jasmine knew there was no turning back. She had crossed a line, openly defying some of the most powerful individuals and institutions in America. As the flames of Supreme Elegance finally began to die down, a new flame was ignited, that of revolution. Jasmine had lit the fuse of a change that could no longer be contained, but with great revelations come great dangers. How would Jasmine navigate the treacherous waters ahead? Who would be her allies, and who would reveal themselves to be a disguised enemy? And most importantly, was she ready for the retaliation that would certainly come? As night fell on New York City, Jasmine knew that the real battle was just beginning. The coming days would test not only her resolve, but the very foundations of American society. Could she turn this moment of crisis into a lasting movement for change? Jasmine's words at the fire scene spread like wildfire. Within hours, her bold declaration had gone viral on social media, transforming into a rallying cry against institutionalized racism in America. The next day, major cities across the country woke up in a fervor. Spontaneous demonstrations flooded the streets, with thousands demanding justice and transparency. Signs bearing Jasmine's face and slogans like "No to Racist Conspiracy" and "Break the Silence" were visible everywhere. Meanwhile, behind the scenes of power, panic was setting in. Politicians were holding emergency meetings, CEOs of large corporations were summoning their lawyers, and judges were frantically discussing the legal implications of Jasmine's revelations. Jasmine, now under 24-hour police protection, worked tirelessly. With Michael's help and Frank's confessions, she began to build a detailed case, connecting the dots of a vast network of corruption and discrimination. Tanya, recovering from the shock of the fire, assumed a leadership role among the former employees of Supreme Elegance. She organized a mutual support group and began gathering more testimonies, further strengthening Jasmine's case. Mrs. Sinclair, devastated by the loss of her boutique, found a new purpose. She volunteered to testify, determined to expose the dark practices that had tainted her business without her knowledge. However, not everything was victories. Richard Thompson, the former manager, made a surprise appearance in the media, presenting himself as the victim of a witch hunt. He claimed that Jasmine was exaggerating the incident for political gain and that his son, Michael, was being manipulated. Richard's strategy found an echo in certain sectors of society. Conservative commentators began to question Jasmine's motives, accusing her of victimization and creating racial divisions where there were none. The pressure on Jasmine increased daily. She received constant threats, and attempts to hack into her computer system became frequent. Her family, worried, begged her to back down. During a particularly tense evening, after a long day of depositions and investigations, Jasmine found herself alone in her apartment, confronted with her doubts and fears. That's when she received an unexpected call. "Jasmine?" The voice on the other end was familiar but unexpected. It was Congressman David Carter, a rising star in the Democratic Party. "Congressman Carter, what's going on?" "Jasmine, I need to tell you something. I've been approached. They want me to use my influence to discredit your investigation." Jasmine's heart raced. "Who, Congressman? Who approached you?" "I can't say over the phone, but it's big, Jasmine. Bigger than we imagined. They're afraid of what you might reveal." The conversation ended abruptly, leaving Jasmine with more questions than answers. She knew she had reached a critical point. The forces opposing her were mobilizing, and she had to act quickly. The next morning, Jasmine called an emergency meeting with her trusted team: Tanya, Michael, Mrs. Sinclair, and a few key allies she had made along the way. "We need to change our strategy," she announced. "They're trying to silence us through official channels, so we're going to take this directly to the people." The plan that followed was bold and risky. They would organize a series of unofficial public hearings, broadcast live on the internet, where they would present all the evidence they had gathered. No filter, no censorship. "It's dangerous, Jasmine," warned Mrs. Sinclair. "They'll do everything to stop us." Jasmine nodded, her determination unwavering. "I know, but we can't back down now. Millions of people are counting on us." As the group finalized the details of the plan, Jasmine looked out the window, observing the city she loved so much. She knew she was about to unleash a storm that would change America forever, but a question lingered. Was she ready for the personal consequences of her actions? And more importantly, was America ready to face the truth she was about to reveal? The coming days would be crucial. Jasmine and her team were about to challenge not just individual racists, but an entire system built on centuries of discrimination. Could they succeed where so many others had failed? The weeks that followed were an emotional roller coaster of events. The online public hearing series, dubbed Truth Unfiltered, had become a national phenomenon. Millions of Americans were tuning in daily, eager for each new revelation. Jasmine, now an almost mythical figure in the fight against racism, faced her greatest personal and professional challenges. Each session was a battle, not only against the system she was exposing, but also against her own insecurities and fears. During the third hearing, as Jasmine was presenting documents linking major businessmen to systems of racial discrimination, her stream was suddenly cut off. Cyber attacks became commonplace, forcing the team to constantly change platforms and strategies. Tanya, who had become Jasmine's right-hand woman, showed surprising strength. She coordinated a growing network of volunteers, ensuring that information continued to circulate even under intense attack. "Jasmine," Tanya said one evening after another tense broadcast, "do you realize how much you've changed? A few months ago you were just a lawyer. Now, you're the voice of millions." Jasmine paused, reflecting on the journey. She had embarked on this fight seeking justice for herself, but now she carried the hopes of an entire nation. The weight of this responsibility was immense, but also transformative. Meanwhile, the establishment's reaction was fierce. Politicians accused Jasmine of judicial activism. Large corporations threatened lawsuits for defamation. Some mainstream media attempted to discredit her work, portraying her as a radical or extremist. It was in this climate of tension that Jasmine received shocking news. Her father, James Williams, had been fired from his job as a high school principal, allegedly for budget cuts. "My daughter," James said on the phone, his voice tired but proud, "don't worry about me. What you're doing is bigger than all of us." These words touched Jasmine deeply. She had always known there would be personal consequences, but seeing her family directly affected was different. For a moment, doubt consumed her. Was it really worth it? It was Michael who brought her back to reality. Richard Thompson's son, who had initially hesitated to expose himself publicly, decided it was time to tell his story. During the 7th online hearing, Michael spoke publicly for the first time. He detailed how he had grown up watching his father, Richard, and other executives systematically manipulate opportunities to keep people of color out of leadership positions. "I've seen this happen since I was a child," Michael revealed, his voice trembling. "It was as if it was normal. But thanks to Ms. Williams, I understood there's nothing normal about it. It's criminal, it's inhuman, and it needs to stop. Michael's testimony was a turning point. His courage to stand up against his own father inspired others to do the same. Former executives, HR employees, and even politicians began to contact Jasmine, offering more evidence and testimonies. The wave of support wasn't limited to the United States. International human rights organizations began to pay attention. Foreign journalists were arriving in the country to cover what was now being called the American anti-racist spring. Jasmine, however, knew the battle was far from over. Each new revelation brought new challenges and dangers. She had to balance the need to expose the truth with the safety of her sources and allies. One evening, after a particularly intense session, Jasmine found herself alone in her makeshift office. Looking at the wall covered with photos, documents, and diagrams connecting the dots of the conspiracy, she felt the weight of everything she had uncovered. At that moment, Mrs. Sinclair quietly entered the room. The former owner of Supreme Elegance had become a motherly figure for the entire team. "Jasmine," she said softly, "have you taken the time to look at yourself recently?" Confused, Jasmine turned to the mirror on the wall. What she saw surprised her. Her eyes, once filled with anger and pain from the incident in the boutique, now shone with determination and purpose. Her posture, once defensive, now radiated confidence and strength. "You're no longer just a victim fighting for justice," Mrs. Sinclair continued. "You've become a symbol of hope and change for millions." Mrs. Sinclair's words resonated deeply. Jasmine realized that her personal journey of healing and growth was intrinsically linked to the broader struggle she was leading. With renewed energy, Jasmine turned to preparations for the next hearing. She knew the coming days would be crucial. The revelations that would follow would shake the power structures in America in an unprecedented way. As she worked, a question echoed in her mind. Now that she had triggered this revolution, was she ready to lead the movement to the end, whatever the personal cost? The next morning would bring answers, but also new challenges. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define the future of the nation. The movement led by Jasmine had reached a critical point. The Truth Unfiltered online hearings were about to enter their final and most explosive phase. Tension was palpable across the country, with the feeling that something big was about to happen. Jasmine and her team worked tirelessly, preparing for what would be the most impactful revelation yet. They had received information from a high-level anonymous source, codenamed the Owl, who promised to expose the final link in the network of corruption and institutional racism. "This goes far beyond Supreme Elegance and a few companies," Sophie explained during a strategy meeting. "We're talking about a system that implicates all three branches of government." Michael, who had become an expert in data analysis, added, "The numbers don't lie. There's a clear pattern of systemic exclusion at all levels of power." While the team prepared, Jasmine faced her own personal challenges. The constant pressure and threats had taken their toll. Sleepless nights and forced separation from her family weighed on her conscience. One afternoon, as she was reviewing documents in her heavily secured office, Jasmine received an unexpected visit. It was her mother, Mrs. Williams, who had outsmarted security to see her daughter. "Mom, how did you get in here?" Jasmine asked, surprised and concerned. Mrs. Williams smiled, showing she still had a few tricks up her sleeve. "My daughter, I came to remind you who you are and where we come from. You carry the weight of the world on your shoulders, but don't forget you're not alone." Her mother's words touched Jasmine deeply. She realized that in the midst of all this struggle, she had distanced herself from her roots, from the strength her family and community had always given her. Reinvigorated by this encounter, Jasmine called a meeting with her entire team, including the allies who had joined them along the way, investigative journalists, human rights activists, and even a few politicians who had decided to break the silence. "What we're about to do," Jasmine began, her voice firm, "will change the course of our country's history. But we must not lose sight of why we started this fight. It's about dignity, equality, and justice for all Americans." The team spent the following days finalizing preparations for the final hearing. Every detail was meticulously planned, from cybersecurity to evacuation routes in case something went wrong. Meanwhile, on the other side of the battle, those in power were not idle. Rumors of an operation to silence Jasmine and her team circulated in the background. Richard Thompson, who had disappeared from public view for weeks, was seen entering and exiting meetings with influential politicians and business leaders. The night before the final hearing, Jasmine received an enigmatic phone call. "Ms. Williams," said a distorted voice, "this is the Owl. Tomorrow, when I reveal my identity, the country will never be the same. Be prepared for the consequences." The call ended abruptly, leaving Jasmine with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. She knew that whatever happened tomorrow, there would be no turning back. That evening, as the nation waited with bated breath, Jasmine gathered her closest team for a moment of reflection. "Tomorrow, we'll face our greatest challenge," she said, looking each one in the eye. "But remember, what we're doing is bigger than any of us. It's about building a future where no one will be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." Jasmine's words resonated in the room, charged with emotion and determination. Each team member felt the weight of responsibility and the importance of the historic moment they were about to experience. As the night progressed, Jasmine prepared for what would be the most important day of her life. The questions that kept her awake were, who was the mysterious owl? What would be revealed? And most importantly, was America ready to face the truth, no matter how painful? The day of the final hearing arrived, bringing with it a palpable tension that hung over the entire country. Millions of people across the nation and around the world were connected, eagerly awaiting the start of the broadcast. Jasmine, dressed in an impeccable suit and exuding an aura of unshakable determination, sat in front of the cameras. Beside her were Tanya, Michael, and Mrs. Sinclair, each representing a different facet of the fight against institutional racism. "Good evening, America," Jasmine began, her voice firm. "Tonight we're not just exposing a system of corruption. We're dismantling centuries of systemic oppression." As Jasmine and her team began presenting the evidence they had gathered, the live stream exploded with comments and reactions. Documents, emails, and recordings revealed a complex network of discrimination that extended to the highest levels of government and the largest corporations in the country. But the real shock was yet to come. When the moment arrived to reveal the identity of the mysterious owl, the transmission was suddenly interrupted. Screens across the country went black for a few tense seconds. When the image returned, it wasn't Jasmine on the screen, but a figure that made the entire nation hold its breath. The Secretary of State, Alexander Morrison. "My fellow Americans," he began, his voice trembling but resolute, "I am the Owl, and I am here to confess my participation and expose the true extent of this corrupt and racist system." What followed was an avalanche of revelations that shook the foundations of power in America. Secretary Morrison detailed how laws were manipulated, how judges were bought, and how a select group of powerful individuals maintained an undeclared system of apartheid in the country. While the secretary spoke, Jasmine and her team worked frantically behind the scenes, struggling to maintain the online broadcast against an increasingly intense series of cyber attacks. Suddenly, the studio door was broken down. Agents from the FBI burst in, brandishing arrest warrants. "Jasmine Williams," shouted the operation leader, "you're under arrest for subversion and threat to national security." At this critical moment, something extraordinary happened. Tanya, showing surprising courage, placed herself between Jasmine and the officers. "If you want to arrest her, you'll have to take me too." Michael joined her, followed by Mrs. Sinclair and other team members. In seconds, a human barrier had formed, protecting Jasmine. Outside the studio, the streets began to fill. Thousands of people, inspired by Jasmine's courage and the shocking revelations, left their homes in a spontaneous act of solidarity and protest. Meanwhile, on social media, the hashtag #IamJasmine became the most shared worldwide in minutes. Celebrities, world leaders, and ordinary citizens were speaking out in support of the movement. In the studio, tension reached its peak when Richard Thompson, the former manager of Supreme Elegance, burst through the door, followed by armed bodyguards. His face was twisted with anger and desperation. "You've destroyed everything," he yelled at Jasmine. "Years of work, the entire system we had built." But before he could continue, Michael stepped forward, confronting his father. "No, Dad. You destroyed lives. You destroyed dreams. And now it's time to rebuild, but on the basis of justice and equality." The confrontation between father and son captured the essence of the conflict dividing the country. It was the old America, rooted in its prejudices and privileges, facing a new generation determined to create a more just and egalitarian society. In this moment of maximum tension, Jasmine made a bold decision. She calmly walked towards the officers, passing through her protective barrier of allies. "I will not resist arrest," she announced, her voice echoing through the studio and being broadcast to millions, "because I know that the truth we've revealed today is bigger than any individual. It's bigger than me, bigger than all of us here. This is about the future of America." As Jasmine was handcuffed, she looked directly at the camera, her eyes shining with a mix of defiance and hope. "America, the fight doesn't stop here. In fact, it's just beginning. Each of you now bears the responsibility to continue what we've started. Don't back down, don't be silent. Change is in your hands." The images of Jasmine being taken into custody, with the crowd in the streets chanting her name, were broadcast live across the country. It was a moment of collective catharsis, a turning point in American history. As the broadcast came to an end, a question hung in the air. What would happen now? Would the revelation of the truth be enough to dismantle decades of institutional racism? Or would the forces of the status quo find a way to smother this nascent revolution? America was on the brink of profound transformation, and the whole world was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. In the days and weeks following the dramatic live broadcast, America experienced an unprecedented transformation. Jasmine's arrest, far from silencing the movement, only further inflamed public indignation. Massive demonstrations flooded the streets of every major American city. The hashtag #CharFreeJasmine dominated social media, not just in the US, but worldwide. International pressure quickly mounted, with world leaders and human rights organizations demanding Jasmine's release and a full investigation into the revelations made. Meanwhile, behind the scenes of power, it was chaos. Secretary Morrison's confessions had triggered a series of investigations that touched the highest echelons of government, the judicial system, and the private sector. Arrests of prominent figures were happening almost daily, each revealing new layers of the racist conspiracy. Tanya, who had become the de facto leader of the movement in Jasmine's absence, coordinated a national network of activists, keeping the pressure on authorities. Michael used his data analysis skills to continue exposing patterns of discrimination, providing ammunition for legal proceedings and policy reforms. After 17 days of intense legal battle and public pressure, Jasmine was finally released. Her exit from prison, broadcast live, was met with celebrations across the country. Crowds gathered to cheer her on, not just as a hero, but as the symbol of a new era for America. In her first speech after her release, Jasmine didn't speak of vengeance but of transformation. "What we've accomplished so far is just the beginning," she declared, her voice hoarse but determined. "Dismantling centuries of institutional racism won't happen overnight, but today we're taking the first step towards a truly just and equitable America." The following weeks saw a series of seismic changes in American society. Anti-discrimination laws were strengthened, racial quotas were expanded, and a national reparations program began to be seriously discussed in Congress. Large corporations, fearing legal and image repercussions, launched ambitious diversity and inclusion programs. Supreme Elegance, now under new leadership led by Mrs. Sinclair, became a model of fair business practices. Richard Thompson and other architects of the racist system faced criminal charges, their convictions serving as a powerful reminder that the era of impunity was over. Jasmine, who had become a figure of national stature, dedicated herself to ensuring that the momentum for change wasn't lost. She traveled the country, speaking at universities, disadvantaged communities and businesses, always emphasizing that the fight for equality was everyone's responsibility. As America embarked on its long journey of healing and reconciliation, one thing was clear: the country would never be the same again. One woman's courage to confront injustice had triggered a peaceful but profound revolution, the effects of which would be felt for generations to come. The Supreme Elegance case, which had begun as an incident of discrimination in a boutique, had become the catalyst for an entire nation to re-examine and rebuild its foundations. 5 years after the events that shook America, Jasmine Williams walked the streets of New York City, observing the subtle but significant changes. Posters celebrating diversity adorned store windows, including that of the renovated Elegance for All, formerly known as Supreme Elegance. As she headed to a conference on racial equality, Jasmine reflected on the long journey traveled and what remained to be done. America had changed, no doubt, but challenges persisted. The fight against racism was ongoing. But there was now real hope. Jasmine smiled, knowing that each step towards equality was a victory shared by millions. Dear viewer, Jasmine's journey shows us that change is possible when we unite against injustice. But the fight against racism doesn't end here. It continues every day in every choice we make. If you've watched this far, comment, "I watched until the end," and share your thoughts on how we can combat racism in our daily lives. Don't forget to click on the video that appears on the final screen. There you'll find more inspiring stories of people making a difference in their communities. Together, we can build a more just and equitable world. Change begins with you.